There are buildings that lie. That's the first thing they teach you in architecture school. Not the load-bearing equations, not the tensile strength of glass, not how to read a blueprint like it's scripture. The first thing, Professor Anand would draw a gleaming tower on the whiteboard, all clean angles and mirrored facades, and then tap the chalk against his temple. "What is it hiding?" he'd ask. "What does it not want you to see?" I thought about that a lot on the morning I walked into Sterling Vane and Associates for the first time. The building occupied 3 floors of a converted Victorian warehouse in Soma. The kind of address that cost a fortune to look like it cost nothing. Exposed brick carefully pressure washed to the exact shade of authentic. Raw concrete poured with the precision of Swiss watchmaking. A lobby that smelled of white tea and engineered ambition. My sneakers squeaked on the polished floor. I noticed this immediately and hated it, the way you hate small vulnerabilities in moments when you need to appear unshakable. I was 24 years old, carrying a portfolio case that was too large for my body, wearing the only blazer I owned. A thrift store find in deep olive green that I'd ironed 3 times that morning. The intern coordinator had told me business casual. I had Googled business casual architecture firm San Francisco at 11 the previous night and arrived at what I now suspected was an incorrect conclusion. The receptionist looked up. She had that particular kind of beauty that is also a kind of armor, bone structure that costs nothing and communicates everything. "Saffron Holloway," I said, "starting today, intern." She smiled the way people smile when they mean something slightly different. "Of course. Miss Sterling Vane will be with you shortly." I had been expecting a coordinator, a junior associate, someone in my own atmospheric bracket. The name landed strangely, Sterling Vane, and I told myself it was probably a different Sterling Vane, a deputy, an assistant to the principal, someone whose last name happened to be the same as the woman on the firm's Wikipedia page. The woman who had been called the most feared developer in the Bay Area. In a 2021 profile, I had spent far too long reading. Studying her photograph the way you study a weather system moving towards you. I sat in a chair with 2 perfect proportions and looked at the models displayed on the far wall. Architectural models under glass, small cities frozen in acrylic and balsa wood, the Marina Heights development, the Embarcadero crossing proposal, the Palo Alto campus expansion, all of them clean, all of them precise, all of them utterly indifferent to the lives they would displace. One of them was the East Side Quarter project. I recognized it from the renderings. Everyone in the community organizing space recognized it. 16 stories of mixed-use development on a site currently occupied by the Delano Street Community Center, a building that had stood for 43 years, that housed after-school programs and a free health clinic, and the only affordable ceramic studio in the district. The proposal had been moving through the City Planning Commission for 8 months. The opposition had filed 3 injunctions. None of them had held. And here I was, sitting in a chair in the building where the whole thing had been designed, clutching my portfolio like a rosary. My hands were completely steady. I was very proud of them. "Miss Holloway." The voice arrived before she did. A quality of sound that seemed to precede its source, low and precisely calibrated, the voice of someone who had learned long ago that she never needed to raise it. Then Thalassa Sterling Vane walked through the glass door at the end of the lobby, and the light shifted in some way I could not immediately account for. She was taller than the photograph suggested. This was the first concrete thought I managed to assemble. The photographs in the profile and the Forbes feature and the AIA Awards ceremony coverage. They had all captured her in the context of other people, which had seemed to diminish her somehow, the way a mountain looks less dramatic when there's nothing in the frame to provide scale. In person, alone in that lobby, she was simply the largest presence in the room. Not physically. She was lean, angular, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit like an architectural drawing. But the gravity of her, the density. She was 41, I knew this from the profile. There were photographs of her at 27, receiving her first major commission, and the comparison was interesting. She had not softened with age the way some people do, had not rounded or blurred at the edges. If anything, the years had refined her into something more essential. Cheekbones that cast shadows, dark hair pulled back with the no-nonsense precision of someone who made decisions about more important things. Eyes that were, I would later decide, the exact gray of marine fog before it burns off. Not cold, exactly, but not offering warmth without earning it. She looked at me for a moment before speaking. Just looked, the way you look at a floor plan before you understand what you're seeing. I was expecting someone older, she said. I was expecting someone else, I answered. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, a recalibration. She extended her hand and I shook it, noting the firm grip, the absence of performance in it. Some powerful people shake hands like they're trying to demonstrate something. Hers felt like a structural connection, a joint-taking load. Come, she said, and turned, and I followed her into the heart of the building. The onboarding was not what I had imagined. I had imagined being handed off to someone junior, given a desk near the supply closet, tasked with scanning documents or making coffee, or, best case, being allowed to sit in on a meeting as a silent observer. This is how internships work. The hierarchy of architectural firms is a beautiful and brutal ecosystem, and at my level, I was plankton. Instead, Thalassa Sterling Vane walked me directly into the main studio. It was an extraordinary space. The whole floor was open plan, the exposed brick of the exterior giving way to interior walls of pale ash wood, the ceiling vaulting up 14 feet to ancient Douglas fir beams. Light fell through north-facing clerestory windows in the particular quality that architects spend entire careers chasing. Diffuse, even, honest. The drafting tables were a mix of hand-drawing setups and high-end monitors, and the people working at them were impossibly good-looking in the way that talented people in expensive cities often are, which is to say they projected the particular confidence of those who have been selected. Several of them looked up when we entered. "This is Saffron Holloway," Thalassa said to the room in general, without breaking her stride. "She'll be working on the East Side Quarter project. Integrate her." Then she walked into her glass-walled office at the far end of the studio and closed the door. I stood there, holding my portfolio case. A man about my age materialized at my elbow, dark-skinned, impeccably dressed in the architectural uniform of slim black trousers and a perfectly fitted shirt, wearing glasses that cost as much as my monthly rent. He was looking at me with an expression of careful neutrality that I would come to understand was his default mode. "Rahim Osi," he said. "Junior associate. I'll show you the ropes." "How often does she do the onboarding herself?" I asked. He paused. "In my 4 years here, never." He let that sit there and I let it sit there with him, and neither of us commented on what it might mean. The East Side Quarter project was everything I had feared and nothing I had been prepared for. From the outside, from the community meetings and the protest signs and the injunction filings, it had looked like the thing these projects always look like: capital-devouring history in the name of progress, a glass tower rising where a community had lived. I had spent 6 months arguing against it from the street level, showing up to planning commission meetings, distributing fact sheets, helping draft op-eds. I knew the surface of it the way you know an enemy's face. Working from inside was something entirely different. The project occupied an entire section of the studio. boards covered in renderings, context maps, section cuts, material samples. A large-scale physical model sat at the center of a dedicated table. The proposed tower in relation to the surrounding neighborhood, delicate and terrifying in its specificity, and the drawings themselves. Even hating what they represented, I could see that they were extraordinary work. The tower was not a blunt intrusion, but a building in genuine conversation with its surroundings. Or trying to be, in the way expensive architecture tries, which is to say, trying in ways that ultimately serve the architecture more than the context. Rahim gave me a thorough briefing. Current status, approved at the first Planning Commission stage, pending final environmental review. Timeline, groundbreaking scheduled for Q2 next year. My role, junior support on documentation and presentation materials for the final approval presentation. She wants fresh eyes on the massing studies, he told me. She thinks the transition at the lower podium level isn't reading right in the section. She's correct, I said, before I could stop myself. It's reading as two separate buildings stacked. The datum line isn't working at ground level. Rahim blinked. Then he pointed at a workstation. That one's yours, he said. Try not to be right out loud too often. It unsettles people. The first week passed in a kind of fever. I worked with the specific intensity of someone trying to solve two problems simultaneously. The architectural problem in front of me and the larger problem underneath it. And at night, I went home to my apartment in the Mission, sat at my kitchen table, and wrote detailed notes about everything I had observed. The project structure, the planning documents, the gaps, the vulnerabilities. I was not proud of this. Or rather, I was proud of the work I was doing in the studio, and uncomfortable about why I was doing it, and aware that these two things existed in a tension I was not sure I could sustain indefinitely. I had taken this internship with a purpose. That purpose had not changed. But the work itself had turned out to be real in a way I hadn't anticipated. And Thalassa Sterling Vane had turned out to be real in a way that complicated everything. She was in the studio more than I expected. I had imagined a principle of her standing would exist, at a remove from the daily work. Gliding in for presentations, delivering pronouncements, departing for lunches with people who controlled zoning decisions. And some of that was true. Her calendar, which I glimpsed occasionally on Rahim's screen, was a dense architecture of meetings and calls that made my own life feel wonderfully simple. But she was also at the drafting table, often late in the day, when the junior staff had cycled out for coffee or were absorbed in their screens. She would be there with trace paper and a soft pencil, working through something by hand. There was a quality to her focus in those moments that I found difficult to look at directly, the same way you find it difficult to look directly at a structure under genuine load, because something about the concentration of force is almost intimate. She hadn't spoken to me again directly after the first day. This was not coldness, I understood. It was simply the gravity of her position. Junior interns did not exist in her direct sphere, unless called there. She operated through Rahim, through her senior associates, through the elaborate and efficient machinery of the firm. On the Thursday of my second week, she called me into her office. I had been there once before briefly, to drop off a printed set of drawings that Rahim needed her to review. The office was all glass on the studio side, private from the outside, furnished with the spare deliberateness of someone who makes aesthetic decisions the way other people make financial ones. Every object exactly chosen, nothing present that wasn't earning its space. One wall was solid books, not decorative ones, actual working architecture books, annotated with post-it flags. The other walls held framed drawings, her own, I assumed, technical drawings elevated to something approaching art by the quality of the line. She was standing at the window when I came in. San Francisco spread out below her in the late afternoon light, the kind of light that makes the city look like it was designed by a cinematographer, which, in a way, it was. Hills and water, and the tangled human palimpsest of 170 years of wanting. "Close the door," she said, without turning. I closed it. "Rahim tells me you identified the podium issue independently." "It seemed evident," I said. "The section drawings show the structural datum reading as a break rather than a transition. It's a scale problem. The proportions of the lower podium are in dialogue with the street, but the tower above them is speaking a different formal language." She turned then, looked at me with that assessing gaze that I was starting to be able to read. Not cold, but expensive with its attention. The way time is expensive when the person spending it has very little of it to waste. "Where did you study?" she asked. "Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Before that, community college. I worked construction summers." Something shifted very slightly in her expression. "Hand drawing?" Obsessively. "My professors thought I was making a political statement. I just liked the contact with the problem." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The datum issue in the podium section." "What would you do?" It felt like a test and also like a genuine question, and I understood that for her these were probably the same thing. "I'd lower the cornice line of the podium by about 2 meters and introduce a horizontal datum element. Something that reads in section and elevation, that ties the building to the adjacent historic fabric. Right now, the tower is landing on the podium like it was placed there from a different project. If you establish a continuous reading at that intermediate level, the tower can do what it wants above, and the street reads the connection rather than the disruption." The silence afterward had a texture to it. "Come back tomorrow at 7, she said. "Bring your ideas in drawing form. We'll work through this section together." I left her office with my heart doing something technically irrational. 7 in the morning, the studio was empty of everyone except the building's overnight cleaning staff, who nodded at me with the equanimity of people who have seen stranger things than an intern arriving at dawn with a portfolio under her arm. I sat up at the big central table, spread my trace paper, uncapped my pencil, and waited. She arrived at 7:02. No greeting. She simply appeared at the table, shed her jacket, rolled her sleeves to the forearm, and looked at what I had laid out. I had drawn 4 iterations of the solution I'd described. Each one pushed the idea a little further. The 4th one was probably too much. A formal move that felt right to me in a way that might have been subjective. The datum element evolving into something that referenced the Victorian cornices of the adjacent streetscape without becoming pastiche. I had been uncertain about including it. I included it anyway. She studied them in silence for a long time. Long enough that I had the unusual experience of not knowing what she was thinking, which was unusual, because I generally had good instincts about people. "This one," she said, pointing to the 4th drawing. "It might be too far?" "Possibly." She picked up a pencil. "Show me how you'd handle the corner condition." What followed was 2 hours of the most absorbing work I had ever done. She drew fast and clean, thinking through the pencil in a way that made visible the process of her mind. Not a straight line from idea to solution, but a series of overlapping attempts, corrections, refinements. The drawing as instrument of thought rather than record of it. I matched her tentatively at first, and then with more confidence, offering alternatives, pushing back when I disagreed, explaining my reasoning. She pushed back harder when she disagreed. No softening, no hedging. Direct and precise, the architectural equivalent of "no, and here's why." I had been braced for this to feel diminishing, the way the corrections of powerful people sometimes feel when they're also assessments of your worth. But it didn't. It felt like being taken seriously. Around 9, Rahim appeared at the studio entrance, stopped when he saw us and quietly retreated without saying anything. I noted this peripherally, the way you note things that will matter later. The corner condition is cleaner than I expected, Thalassa said, studying our accumulated drawings. The datum terminates correctly. It's not resolving in section at the northeastern corner, though. Look. She pointed, and she was right. There was a reading problem at the internal corner, where the datum met the existing party wall. I looked at it, thought, drew something quickly. She leaned over the drawing. She was close enough that I could smell, very faintly, something that was probably her perfume, and was probably expensive, and was almost certainly not what I should be cataloging at 9 in the morning while trying to solve an architectural problem. Yes, she said, that's it. We straightened at the same moment, caught each other at an unexpected proximity. Her gaze held mine for a beat longer than the situation required, and then she stepped back, very naturally, and picked up the drawings. I'll have these developed by the section team, she said. Your input will be credited in the project notes. It was not an effusive thing to say, but from her, in the economy of her particular register, it meant something. The weeks that followed had a quality I would struggle, later, to describe accurately. I was learning to see the project from the inside, which meant I was also learning to hold two conflicting visions of it simultaneously, like an architectural double exposure. There was the building as it existed in the studio, a genuine piece of design thinking, the product of real intelligence and craft, something that would, if built, be beautiful in the way ambitious buildings are beautiful regardless of what they replace. And there was the building as it existed in the neighborhood. The end of something, the displacement of a community that had been displaced before and could not afford to be displaced again. I kept both images in mind. I had to. The early morning sessions became a pattern. Not every day, but 2 or 3 times a week. I would arrive before the rest of the staff to find Thalassa already at the table, working, and she would look up and we would fall into it. The drawing, the thinking, the back and forth that felt less like mentorship and more like something I didn't have an architectural word for, a conversation conducted in a language that required both of us. I learned things about her in those hours that were not in any profile or feature. That she had grown up in Portland, the daughter of a contractor father who had gone bankrupt when she was 12 and rebuilt himself by the time she was 20. That she had taken her mother's name for the firm, Sterling, and the name of a professor who had changed her life, Vane, and joined them without apology, which struck me as an act of both gratitude and precision. That she had a habit, when she was thinking hard, of pressing the blunt end of her pencil against her lower lip, which I was developing a strong and inconvenient interest in not noticing. She learned things about me, too. I gave her less than she gave me. This was partially strategy and partially something harder to name. The instinct of self-protection that kicks in when you feel yourself wanting to give more. She knew I had grown up in Fresno, that my mother was a public school art teacher, that I'd gotten to Cal Poly on grants and scholarships, and the particular stubbornness that comes from being told, in various ways and at various volumes, that places like this were not for people like you. She didn't offer commentary on any of this. She simply received it the way she received a drawing, with full attention, with the intelligence turned on. You should be presenting at the Planning Commission, she said one morning, without preamble, about 3 weeks in. Not just supporting the presentation, leading it. I looked up from the section I was developing. I'm an intern. I'm aware of your employment status. She didn't look up from her own drawing. The commission is going to push back on the heritage impact. You understand the street-level arguments better than anyone on the team. That's not a function of experience. It's a function of perspective. The irony of this was not lost on me, and I sat with it for a moment. The magnata whose project I was secretly trying to stop, telling me I was uniquely positioned to defend it. "You'd put an intern on the podium at a planning commission hearing," I said carefully. "I'd put the best person for the argument in the room," she said. "The title is secondary, the work isn't." I went back to my drawing. My hands were steady. They had been steady since the first day. It was a Wednesday evening, the fourth week, when everything shifted in the way that changes the load distribution of a structure. Not immediately visible on the surface, but the building is already different. Everyone else had gone home. This was unusual only in that I was still there too, having lost myself in a model study that had started simple and evolved, as model studies often do, into an engrossing three-dimensional argument with a project. I was cutting sections through a scale model with a scalpel, and the studio was quiet in the particular way of large spaces. After hours, the ambient noise of the building reduced to a kind of structural hum. She came out of her office at nearly 9, jacket on, bag shouldered, and stopped when she saw me. "You're still here," she said. "So are you." A beat. She looked at the model I was working on, looked at it with the professional gaze first, then with something that was slightly different. "That's not in the current brief," she said. "No." I set down the scalpel. I was trying to understand what happens if the ground floor program is opened up. Permeable edges, active frontage on 3 sides instead of 1. The current scheme walls off the east elevation. The east elevation faces the party wall. The party wall could become a feature. The adjacent building has a painted mural. It's been there since 1987. It's a neighborhood landmark. The current scheme buries it. If you open the ground level and treat the mural wall as a backdrop to a public passage, you keep the cultural memory of the site while activating new public space. She was silent. She crossed the room and looked at the model from different angles, which required her to lean over the table, which put her close to where I was standing. And I was very aware of this in a way that I was trying not to catalog, but was cataloging anyway. "The party wall belongs to the neighboring property owner," she said finally. "I know, but a public passage easement isn't complicated. The city actually offers incentives for active ground floor contributions. It would improve the planning commission score, and—" I stopped. "I'm aware this is outside my scope." "It is." She straightened, looked at me directly. "But it's not wrong." The word "wrong" in her vocabulary, I had learned, was its own structure, a load-bearing term. Its absence meant something. "Why do you care this much?" she asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. The real question was audible under the surface the words. I could have deflected. I had deflection strategies prepared, had been keeping them in reserve for a moment, exactly like this one. Instead, I heard myself say, "Because the Delano Street Community Center is where my cousin got sober. Because the free health clinic on its ground floor caught my aunt's cervical cancer at stage 2. Because the ceramics studio in the basement is where I first understood that making things with your hands was how I needed to move through the world. Because when you tear down a building, you tear down everything that happened inside it, and that matters even when the building itself isn't remarkable." The studio was very quiet. She was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Not surprise exactly, more like something she had been bracing against had landed anyway, had gotten through the defensive architecture. "You know the Delano Center," she said. "I grew up going there every summer. My grandmother lived 3 blocks away." Another silence. This one had a different quality from the others we had shared. Less professional, less bounded, something slightly uncontrolled in it. "Miss Halloway," she began. "Saffron," I said. "If we're going to be here until 9 in the evening working on a model I built for reasons I just confessed to, I think first names are reasonable." The corner of her mouth moved. That almost smile. Thalassa, she said. And then, after a pause that felt like a structural decision, have you eaten? We went to a noodle place 2 blocks away, the kind that's been in the same location for 30 years and shows no interest in being discovered. She ordered without consulting the menu. I ordered the same thing she did because I was distracted by the strangeness of sitting across a formica table from Thalassa Sterling Vane in a room that smelled of ginger and star anise. She was different outside the building. Not softer, she was not, I would come to understand, a person who softened exactly, the way some materials don't soften but change state entirely under heat. More present somehow. The professional compression of the studio had given way to something larger. We talked about architecture for an hour, genuinely, freely, the way I had talked about it in school, before the weight of the industry settled on it. She had opinions that surprised me, a deep skepticism about certain canonical modernist projects that fetishized austerity, a love for Brazilian brutalism that I shared, a quietly fierce position on the relationship between architectural ambition and social obligation. That was, I realized slowly, in genuine tension with the work she was known for. Do you think great architecture can justify displacement? I asked. Directly. I hadn't planned to be direct. It arrived before the editorial function could intercept it. She looked at me across the table. No, she said. I think it sometimes does anyway. That's not the same as justifying it. No, she said again, and the weight in the repetition was something I felt in my chest. It's not. We walked back to the building for our bags in a silence that felt like the aftermath of something. She paused at the lobby entrance. The mural wall, she said, developed the ground floor study. Full section, elevation, program proposal. I want to see it properly drawn. I looked at her. You're serious? I'm always serious. The almost smile again, closer this time. I'm told it's a character flaw, she went in. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the San Francisco night, in the particular chill that slides in off the bay after dark, and understood that something had changed in the load distribution of everything, and that there was no going back to the configuration that had existed before. The mural wall study took me 4 days. I drew it by hand first, which was inefficient and correct, then translated it into the firm's drafting software, which could do in minutes what had taken me hours, and captured none of what the hours had found. When I presented it to Thalassa, in her office early morning, just the 2 of us, she stood at the drawings for a long time without speaking. Long enough that I had to stop myself from filling the silence with justification, which would have been the wrong thing to do, and which she would have recognized as weakness. The passage geometry is tight at the south end, she said finally. I know. The structural base spacing doesn't give me more than 4 meters clearance without impacting the ground floor plan. But 4 meters is enough for the program I'm proposing. It reads as intimate rather than monumental. The Delano Center's ground floor was never monumental. You're designing a memorial, she said. I'm designing continuity, I said. Which is different, she looked at me. Really looked the way she had that first evening in the studio, and I understood that the look was doing something, assessing something that was not entirely professional in nature, and that we were both, for now, pretending otherwise. Present this to the section team on Friday, she said. I'll attend. You attend section team presentations when the work warrants it. She handed the drawings back to me. Our fingers did not touch. This felt like a deliberate fact. It was Ram who said it first. Not to me, but near me, which in an open-plan studio is functionally the same thing. He was talking to Priya, the senior associate who managed project scheduling, in the low-voiced lateral murmur that constituted office conversation in the studio. I was at my workstation, ostensibly focused on the screen, translating hand sketches into the drafting software with one part of my brain while the other eavesdropped with the practiced unobtrusiveness of someone who grew up in a small house. "She's in early again," Priya said. "3 times this week," Rahim confirmed. "4," said Priya. "I was here Tuesday." A silence. Then Priya again. "She hasn't done that for anyone since the Kellerman Project." I did not know what the Kellerman Project was. I made a mental note to find out, and then a second mental note, reminding myself that this line of inquiry was not professional development, and was not helping the community center, and was not something I should be pursuing with anything resembling enthusiasm. I pursued it with enthusiasm. The Kellerman Project turned out to be a residential commission from 6 years ago. A private household in Marin, the kind of project that architecture firms do occasionally to remind themselves that buildings can be experienced by humans rather than optimized for investment portfolios. The client was a film director named Kellerman, who had given Thalassa unusual creative latitude. The resulting house had won 2 awards and been featured in 4 publications. More relevantly, the project architect had been a woman named Devora Lane, who had subsequently left the firm, and who, based on the extremely non-comprehensive research I conducted in the 20 minutes while pretending to refine a wall section, had not publicly discussed her time at Sterling Vane and Associates at all. I closed the browser and sat with this information for a while. Then I went back to the wall section, which needed refinement anyway. What I understood, what I allowed myself to understand, was that Thalassa's particular attention, her early mornings, her directness, the way she spoke in the studio with a quality of focus that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, none of this was unprecedented. It had happened before. It had presumably become something. And then that something had ended. And the person it had happened with had left the firm and left the record entirely. This was a reasonable history for a powerful woman to have. It was also a reasonable history to heed. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table with the planning documents spread in front of me. The Heritage Impact Assessment, the Community Engagement Logs, the Environmental Review Summary, and I read them with the particular cold clarity that arrives when you are trying to talk yourself back into a simpler version of a situation. The irregularities were still there. The case was still buildable. Nothing about working beside Thalassa Sterling Vane changed the arithmetic of what was going to happen to the Delano Center if no one changed it. I read the documents until 1 in the morning. Then I put them away, changed the structural decision they represented, and went to bed without resolving anything. There was a Thursday when it rained. San Francisco rain in November is not the dramatic event it is in other places. No thunder, no great operatic gesture from the sky. It simply arrives, persistent and silver, and lowers the quality of the light and makes the city feel like a city operating at a more honest register than the one it normally projects. I liked it. I had grown up in Fresno's hot, specific clarity, and the fog and rain of San Francisco had always felt to me like the weather of a place that was thinking. I arrived early, as usual. The studio was quiet. The building's heating system was doing something subtle and effective, and the rain on the clerestory windows made a sound like someone running a finger lightly along the surface of things. Thalassa was at the table with a cup of coffee and a set of drawings I didn't recognize. Not the East Side Quarter, something else, smaller scaled and more intimate. She looked up when I came in but didn't stop what she was doing, which I had come to understand as the highest form of acknowledgement in her register. I made coffee set up at my usual position, and we worked. After a while I asked about the drawings she was looking at. "Unbuilt project," she said. "I review them sometimes. Unbuilt by choice or circumstance?" She considered this. Both. The client ran out of conviction before the money ran out. Sometimes that's the worst loss. I looked at what I could see of the drawings from my angle. A small community library, it seemed, modest scale, deeply considered. The kind of building that was the opposite of the East Side Quarter Tower in every formal register. You design like this, I said, and then you also design the tower. Her voice was level. Yes, I'm not criticizing. I know you're not. She picked up her pencil and made a small correction to something on her drawing. You're asking a question you've been careful not to ask directly. I said nothing. The rain said something instead, against the windows. Architecture is two practices that occupy the same body, she said, still drawing. The practice you do for clients who have the kind of money that shapes cities, and the practice you do for the version of yourself that became an architect in the first place. Very few people get to do only the second one. The ones who claim they do are usually lying or broke. Or both, I said, or both. The almost smile. The question is whether you manage to stay in conversation with the first version of yourself while the second version pays the bills. And do you? She was quiet for a moment. She set the pencil down and looked at the small library drawings in a way that had nothing professional in it. Less than I used to, she said. More than I thought possible lately. The rain made its soft, continuous sound. I did not look at her, and she did not look at me. And the thing that was happening between us proceeded without being directly acknowledged. The way structural movement proceeds in a building before it becomes visible at the surface. On the Friday of my 5th week, presenting to the section team in the large conference room, with Thalassa sitting at the back of the room with her arms crossed and her expression neutral, I understood something I should probably have understood earlier. I was not going to be able to sustain the original plan. I had come here to find the weakness in the project's planning documentation. The heritage assessment that I suspected had been improperly conducted. The community engagement record that I believed had been strategically incomplete. I had been inside for 5 weeks, and I had found both things. The material was there. The case was buildable. But the building that was being designed in this room was different from the building I had been opposing from the street. Not because it wasn't going to demolish the Delano Center. It still was. But because inside the making of it was a woman who, under the compression of her life and her choices, carried something she hadn't shown the world yet, and I was becoming, against every rational interest I possessed, the person she was beginning to show it to. The presentation went well. The section team engaged with the mural wall proposal seriously, which I hadn't fully expected, and by the end of the session, 3 things had been added to the project for development. Thalassa left without comment, but as she reached the door she paused and looked back and gave me the smallest nod. Precise and considered, and, in its particular economy, worth more than a longer gesture would have been. I drove home that night through the lit streets of the city she was reshaping, and sat in my car outside my building for 20 minutes, thinking about load-bearing structures and the terrible efficiency of love getting in under your defenses through the drawings.